The last building I ever inventoried for the county was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. There were no people inside, no squatters, no kids breaking in, no bitter old employee hiding in the dark with a pencil. But the walls were writing. Not old graffiti, not jokes, confessions, real ones. Things people had buried for years. Crimes, lies, betrayals, names that should not have been known by anyone still alive. By the end of that week, the building had written mine too. That is why I keep every light in my house on now. That is why I throw away every receipt before I can turn it over. That is why I do not read anything written on a wall, a mirror, a fogged window, or the back of a piece of paper. Because somewhere, something is still finishing my sentence. I thought I was there to count furniture, boxes, and old county equipment. I did not understand that the building had been waiting for someone to count the sins. You can call me Davis. That is close enough to my real name, and after what happened inside the Mercer Street Annex, close enough is all I am willing to give. I was a facilities coordinator, which is a polite way of saying I knew where the keys were and which buildings were falling apart and how much it would cost to keep them from falling apart faster. I'd come up through maintenance, started as a man with a mop bucket in a courthouse basement when I was 22. And by the time this happened, I was 51 and tired in the way you get tired when your work is mostly about decay. You learn that everything the county owns is dying a little every day, and your whole job is slowing it down. You stop expecting things to last. The building was the old Mercer Street Municipal Annex. People my age called it the Records Building, though it had held a dozen things over the years. The assessor's office, a part of the health department, a courtroom for traffic cases, and for the last stretch of its working life, the county recorder's archive. Births, deaths, deeds, marriages, the paper trail of everyone who'd ever lived in the county, and a lot of people who'd only passed through. It had been closed since 2009. That was when the new administration center went up across town with climate control and digital servers and parking that didn't flood. The annex just sat there after that. 3 stories of pale brick, gone gray, narrow windows, a flat roof that leaked, and a cornerstone that said 1931. The county kept paying to keep the power minimally on and the pipes from bursting, the way you keep a relative on a ventilator, because nobody wants to be the one who signs the form. In the fall of the year this happened, somebody finally signed the form. The annex was going to be sold to a developer who wanted to gut it for apartments. And before that could close, the county needed a full inventory. What was still inside, what had value, what was hazardous, what had to be archived properly, and what could be thrown out. That was my job. They gave me 2 weeks, a key ring, a clipboard, and a kid named Owen from the assessor's office to help me carry boxes and run the camera. Owen was 24 and treated the whole thing like a vacation from his desk. I want to be careful when I talk about Owen because he was a good kid and what happened wasn't fair. And I've never told his mother the truth because the truth would only hurt her and she wouldn't believe it anyway. We started on a Monday, October. The kind of cold that isn't cold yet, just a promise of it. where the mornings smell like wet leaves and the afternoons still get warm enough that you take your jacket off. I remember the smell of the building when we first opened it because it was so ordinary. Dust, old paper, a little mildew, the chemical ghost of decades of floor wax. Buildings that have been closed a long time have a particular smell, and it's not frightening. It's sad. It smells like a thing waiting. I'd smelled it 100 times. The power came on slow. Half the fluorescent tubes were dead, and the ones that worked buzzed and flickered before they steadied. We had a few work lamps we set up in the rooms we were processing. The elevator was locked out, so everything was stairs, which Owen complained about cheerfully. The first floor was easy. Empty offices, some abandoned furniture, a break room with a refrigerator that somebody mercifully had emptied and propped open before they left in 2009. We logged it all. Desk, metal, poor condition. Filing cabinet 4-drawer, empty. The work was boring, and boring was exactly what I wanted from it. The first wrong thing was so small that I almost let it become ordinary. I registered it as a maintenance note. In the second floor hallway, on the plaster between two office doors, somebody had written on the wall. Just a few words in pencil, small and neat, about chest height. I assumed graffiti, because what else would it be? An empty building. Kids get in. That's the whole story of every abandoned place. I wrote on my clipboard, second floor hall, vandalism, plaster, minor. And then because I'm the kind of man who reads things, I read it. It was written in pencil, but something about it felt too careful to be vandalism. It said, I told her the baby was stillborn, but it wasn't, and I gave it to the Coyle family and took money for it. I want to be honest about my reaction, which was nothing. I read it the way you read a sentence in a book you're not really paying attention to. It slid right off me. Some kid's idea of a creepy joke, or a line from a song I didn't know, or just the kind of thing people write on walls to feel like they've left a mark. I even thought in a distracted way that it was strangely specific for graffiti. Graffiti is usually a name, a date, a curse word, a drawing. This was a sentence with grammar. But I had 2 floors to inventory and a kid asking me where the bathrooms were, and I let it go. By the end of the first day, I'd noticed 4 more. They were all like that. All in pencil, all neat, all at the same height, all in different spots. One inside a supply closet, one low on the wall behind where a desk had been, one in the stairwell. I started writing them down, not because I thought they meant anything, but because I'd been doing this job long enough to be thorough. And extensive wall vandalism was the kind of thing that affected what the building was worth and what it would cost to fix. I copied a couple of them onto my clipboard, the short ones. One said, I let my brother take the blame because I was afraid and he died inside. One said, the fire at the Linden Street store was me. I was paid to do it. I showed Owen because by then it had crossed over from boring into mildly interesting, the way a weird thing at work is a relief. He read them and laughed and said something like, somebody's been watching too many true crime shows. And I agreed with him and we packed up for the day. I remember locking the front door and the cold coming on as the sun went down, and I remember thinking that the building wasn't creepy exactly, it was just empty. There's a difference. I knew the difference then. The building taught me not to. That night I did something I want you to understand. It wasn't suspicion. It was just habit and a little boredom. And the fact that the sentences had stuck in my head more than I wanted them to. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I looked up the Linden Street store fire. I expected nothing. I expected the kind of nothing you get when you look up something a teenager scrawled on a wall. There had been a Linden Street store, a hardware store, family-owned, and it had burned in 1978. I was a child then. I didn't remember it. The article I found was a scanned newspaper page, the print soft and gray. Fire ruled suspicious. Owner suspected of insurance fraud, never charged, died in the 80s. No mention of anyone paid to set it. But the fire was real. The street was real. And I sat there longer than I should have, telling myself that an old fire is a thing a local kid might know about, might have heard a grandparent mention, might use to make their wall writing seem more real. That's a perfectly good explanation. I held on to it. I slept fine that night. That's the part I think about. I slept fine. The second day was when I started reading them on purpose. I told myself it was for the inventory. That was the lie I needed. The truth was simpler and worse. I wanted to know. Curiosity is not harmless. Not in places like that. Curiosity is the door. And I opened it myself with my own hand. There were more on the third floor. The third floor was where the records had been kept. Long rows of empty steel shelving, the air dryer up there, dustier. And the writing was denser. Whole sections of wall between the shelves, sentence after sentence, all in that same neat pencil, all at the same height. As if one person of average build had walked the length of every wall in the building writing one confession at a time. Because that's what they were. I'd stopped being able to call them anything else by the third day. They were confessions. Every single one was someone admitting to something, not threats, not stories, not random ugliness. Admissions. I took my own money out of the church collection for 2 years. I knew he was hitting her and I said nothing because he was my friend. I have never told anyone that the accident on Route 9 was my fault and I drove away. They were specific in the way that real things are specific. Route numbers, first names, years sometimes. The texture of true things. Owen found one that afternoon that changed how I felt, though I didn't admit it to him. He called me over to the far wall of the third floor, near the windows, and he wasn't laughing this time. He was quiet. He pointed at a line of pencil and said, "Read that." It said, "I am Raymond Tolley, and I worked in this building for 31 years, and I changed the date on the Wells deed so the bank could take the farm, and I have never said it out loud until now." Owen said, "My grandma knew a toll who worked at the county. He died like 10 years ago, and then he said the thing that I've thought about every day since. He said, how would a kid know all this? And I didn't have an answer, so I gave him the answer I'd been giving myself. I said, maybe it's not a kid, maybe it's some old guy who used to work here, coming back and writing down everything he knows about everybody. bitter retiree with a pencil. People are strange. And Owen nodded, because he wanted to believe me the way I wanted to believe me. But neither of us picked the camera back up for a while. We just stood there in the dust, looking at 30 years of one dead man's life confessed onto a wall. I want to slow down here and tell you about the building's logic, because this is the part where I started to understand the rule, even though I fought understanding it for as long as I could. The confessions were not all from the same person. That much became obvious the more I read. The handwriting was identical, every single one, the same neat slope, but the voices were not. Different people, different eras, different secrets, all written in one hand, as if the building had one hand, and everyone who entered only supplied the guilt. And the more I read, the more I noticed something about the location of them. They were densest where people had spent the most time. The third floor archive where Tola had worked 31 years. The old courtroom on the second floor, where the walls near where the bench had been were almost black with pencil. Every confession there, a confession of a lie, a perjury, a thing said under oath that wasn't true. The break room, the clerk's window, the places where humans had stood and sat and waited and worked and apparently carried things they never said. I started to feel that the building wasn't being vandalized. It was leaking. That's the only word I had for it. Everything that had ever been kept quiet inside those walls was seeping back out through them in pencil at the height of a hand. And here's the detail that I have never been able to explain and have stopped trying to. Every confession looked freshly written. I don't mean it looked old. I mean it was fresh in a way that didn't make sense. When you write on plaster with a graphite pencil and leave it for years, it changes. It gets a faint shine. It smudges. Dust settles into the grooves. These didn't. They were sharp and matte and clean. And when Owen touched one with his thumb just to see, the graphite came off on his skin like it had been written that morning. All of them. The ones quoting men who'd been dead for decades were as fresh as if the dead men had walked in that morning and written them. I told myself the building was sealed and dry and that maybe pencil just lasts. That's not true. I knew it wasn't true. But you have to understand that I had 19 years of believing in concrete and pipes and rot in a world that obeyed cost estimates. And I was not going to give that up over some marks on a wall. I needed it to be vandalism. I needed it the way you need a railing on a high staircase. But the third night I didn't sleep fine. I want to tell you about my wife now, because she's part of this. And because leaving her out would make me a coward and tell him the way I was a coward in the living. Her name was Caroline. We'd been married 26 years. We had one son, grown and moved to Denver, who called on Sundays. And about a year before all this, Caroline had started forgetting things. Small at first, then less small. The doctors had a word for it, the word everyone dreads. We were still in the early part then. She was herself most days. But little holes had started opening in her memory, and both of us pretended not to see them. I tell you this because of what the building did, and because of the thing I'd done that I had never told her, and that I had never told anyone, and that I had carried for almost 30 years, the way Tola carried his deed. I'm going to tell you now, because the building made me, and because I think the telling is the only thing left that I can control. When Caroline and I had been married 3 years, I had an affair. It lasted 4 months. The woman moved away and I ended it, and I never told Caroline. And I decided, the way you decide these things, that the kindest thing was to carry it alone forever. I built my whole marriage on the far side of that decision. I was a good husband after that, a faithful one, a present one. And I told myself that the goodness was real and the lie was just the foundation it stood on, and that you don't dig up a foundation just to look at it. 23 years. I had not thought about it in a focused way in a long time. I'd filed it the way the building filed things, in a room nobody went into anymore. On the 4th day, the building stopped writing about other people. It wrote about me. It was on the 2nd floor in the hallway, where I'd seen the very first one near the office I'd been using as a staging area for boxes. I almost walked past it. Then a word caught my eye, a name, and the name was Caroline. I read it standing very still. It said, "My name is Davis, and in the 3rd year of my marriage, I betrayed Caroline. Then I let her spend 23 years loving a man who had never once given her the whole truth." It was in the same handwriting as all the others. The neat slope, the hand of the building, it was fresh. When I made myself touch it, the graphite came off on my thumb. I'm not going to pretend I behaved well. I scrubbed at it with my sleeve hard and it didn't come off. It only smeared. And I stood there in the empty hallway with my heart going and my sleeve gray. And I felt something I'd never felt in 19 years of that job, which was that the building knew me, not knew about me. Knew me the way you know a thing you've decided to keep. And I understood all at once and against my will what the building was actually doing. And it was not leaking the past. It was collecting the present. It was taking what people kept, and it had taken mine. And once it had your secret on the wall, you were part of the building. I didn't tell Owen. That's important. I didn't tell Owen because telling him would have meant explaining the words, and I had spent 23 years not explaining those words. And a haunted wall was not going to make me explain them. So I did the cowardly, practical thing. I told Owen we'd finish the 2nd floor faster than I'd thought. And we'd move to the basement, which I hadn't even opened yet. To get it out of the way, I wanted to be on a different floor than my own confession. The basement is where it stopped being something I could survive whole. The annex basement was the original 1931 foundation. Low ceilings, exposed pipe, a smell of cold stone, and standing water. There was a boiler room, a few storage vaults with heavy doors, and at the far end, behind a door that my key ring didn't have a key for, something we could hear before we could see. A sound came from behind it, dry, small, patient, pencil on plaster. Owen heard it too. I want that on the record, that we both heard it, because for everything else that happened, I'm the only witness. But Owen heard the writing in the basement, and his face, when he heard it, is a thing I'll carry as long as I carry anything. He said, "Slow, is somebody down here?" And I said no, because the building had been sealed and I had the only keys. and the scratching kept going behind the door that I had no key for, steady as a clock. The sound of a hand at chest height moving along a wall. I should have left. I want to be clear that I knew, standing in that basement, that the smart and living thing to do was to walk up the stairs and out the front door and call the developer and tell them the inventory would be late and let the wrecking crew deal with whatever was behind that door. I knew it, and I want you to understand why I didn't. Because it wasn't bravery and it wasn't even curiosity by then. It was that the building had my confession. And as long as it had my confession on the wall where anyone could read it, it had a piece of me. And I could not stand to leave a piece of me down there in the dark, scratching. I wanted it back. That's the truth, and it's a stupid, human, fatal truth. The building doesn't take you by force. It takes you by the thing you most want to take back. The door without a key opened when I touched it. The lock just gave. The way the power had come on slow, the way everything in that building cooperated with exactly the wrong thing. The room behind it was small and the walls were covered, floor to ceiling, every inch, in the neat, sloping hand, layers of it, confession over confession written so densely that in places it was just gray. The graphite built up like soot. And there was no one in the room. The scratching had stopped the moment the door opened. But there was a single confession, fresh, in the center of the wall facing the door, written larger than the rest, at the height of my own eyes. And it had not been there a moment before because I watched the last few words finish. Watched the graphite lay itself down on the plaster with no hand holding the pencil, and the pencil itself lying on the floor below it, just an ordinary yellow pencil, worn down to a stub. It said Owen Reyes stole $40 from his mother's purse when he was 9. He never told her. She still believes he is the only honest person in her life. I turned around, and Owen was standing in the doorway reading it over my shoulder. In his face, he was 24, and he just watched a wall write the smallest, truest, most secret thing he had. A child's secret. $40? Nothing. And the nothing of it was the worst part, because if the building knew that, it knew everything. And his face came apart in a way I have only seen on people at funerals. He looked at me like I brought him here, and I had. I'd brought him here. Here is what I have pieced together in the long nights since about how it works. I don't fully understand it. The narrator who fully understands it is a liar, and I've decided not to be one anymore. That's the whole reason I'm telling you this. But here's what I think. The building was a place where people went to make the truth official. That's what a recorder's office is. You're born, they write it down, it's true. You marry, you die, you buy land, they write it down. And the writing is what makes it real in the eyes of everyone. For 78 years, people walked into that building and made things true by writing them. And something in the building learned the shape of that. Learned that truth is a thing you write down. That a confession unwritten isn't quite real. And a confession written is real forever. And can never be taken back. And it got hungry for the ones people wouldn't write. The births recorded as stillbirths. The lies sworn as oaths. The deeds with the dates changed. Everything that should have been written and wasn't. The building wanted the rest of the record, the true record. And the only way to complete a record is to write down the parts that were left out. And the only way to get those parts is to take them out of the people who carry them. It doesn't hurt you. I keep saying that because it matters. It doesn't burn you or chase you or tear you apart. It just writes you down. It takes the one thing you decided would never be written, and it writes it in its own neat hand on its wall forever. And once it's written, you belong to the record, and the building keeps you the way it keeps the deeds and the death certificates. Filed. True. Permanent. Part of the archive of everything that was ever real in that county. Owen ran. I don't blame him. He ran up the basement stairs, and I heard the front door bang, and I heard his car, and I thought, good, get out, go home, this isn't yours. I brought you into it, and now you're out of it. I genuinely thought he was safe. He'd driven away. The accident on Route 9 in one of the confessions, the man who drove away from his own fault. I thought of that even then, and I thought, Owen drove away clean. He didn't do anything. He was just a kid I dragged into a basement. But the building had already written him down. That was the thing I didn't understand until it was too late. Running doesn't matter once you're on the wall. You can leave the building. The building doesn't need you to stay. It's already got the true part of you, the recorded part, and the rest of you is just the body that the record refers to, and the record is what's permanent, not the body. Owen died 11 days later. I'm going to tell it plainly because dressing it up would be obscene. He was driving home from his mother's house where he had gone, I found out later, to finally tell her about the $40. His mother told me that at the visitation, not knowing what she was telling me. She said he came over Sunday and out of nowhere he confessed this silly thing from when he was a little boy. Money he'd taken. He was crying about it. I told him I'd known the whole time and forgiven him before he could even spell. And he hugged me. And he seemed so much lighter when he left. She thought it was a blessing. She thought in the days after that at least he'd gotten that off his chest. At least he left feeling clean. He drove off the road on a dry night, on a straight stretch, with no one else around. They said he must have fallen asleep. He was 24, and it was 8 in the evening, and he'd had 1 cup of coffee at his mother's, and he was not asleep. The building had finished writing him. He'd even tried to take it back, tried to make the confession his own, to say it himself to the one person it was about, the way I'm trying to say mine now to you, and it didn't matter, because the building had already recorded it first. You can't unwrite something from that wall by confessing it somewhere else. The wall is the official copy. The wall always was. I do not think 11 days was a rule. That is important. I think Owen's sentence was short. Small secret, wait. Simple guilt, at least to the building. It had written him quickly and completely. When there was nothing left to record, the rest of him became unnecessary. Mine was different. Mine had roots. Caroline. The affair. The relief I felt because her illness would protect me. The years I had spent building a decent life on top of one rotten truth. That was when I understood the real danger. Not that I had 11 days. That was only Owen's number. The danger was that the building had started a sentence about me, and sooner or later, somewhere, it would finish it. I was on the wall. I was in the record. I went back. Of course I went back. This is the part where you'll want me to do something clever. Find some loophole. Burn the building. Scrub the wall. Find the old pencil and break it. I tried the obvious things. I went back the day after Owen's funeral at night with a 5-gallon bucket of primer and a roller and a wire brush and a sledgehammer in the trunk in case the primer didn't work. I was going to paint over my confession. I was going to bury it under so many coats of white that it would stop being written, stop being read, stop being part of the record. I had the idea, the desperate, hopeful idea, that if I could make it unreadable, I could make it untrue again, the way it had been untrue, or at least unwritten, for 23 years. The building let me in. It always let me in. That should have told me everything. I painted over my confession on the second floor. 3 coats. The plaster drank the first 2, and I did a third anyway. And I stood there with the roller in my hand, looking at a clean white rectangle of wall where my whole secret marriage had been spelled out. And I felt for about 4 seconds the most enormous relief of my life. I'd done it. I'd taken it back. Then the paint moved, not dramatically. It didn't bleed or run or do anything from a film. The graphite simply rose up through the 3 coats of primer the way damp comes through a ceiling, slow and gray. The letters reassembling themselves out from under the white. The neat, sloping hand surfacing through everything I'd put over it, until my confession was there again, exactly as it had been, with my thumbprint smear and all on top of the white now, fresh, the graphite coming off when I touched it. The building had let me try only so I would understand that nothing written there could be covered. It was patient that way. It was teaching me. It had all the time in the world because it had already won, and it wanted me to know it. And next to my confession, while I stood there with the wet roller dripping primer on my shoes, a new line began to write itself in the same hand, the graphite laying down letter by letter at the height of my eyes. I watched it write. I'll tell you exactly what it wrote, because it's the reason I keep the lights on and keep paper out of the house and don't read what's written on walls. It wrote, "Davis knows Caroline will forget him before the sentence is finished. And part of him is grateful, because it means she will never read what he really is." That was the cruelty of it. The affair was the sin. But this was worse. This was the truth underneath the sin. That some hidden part of me was relieved my wife might forget me before she ever learned what I had done. The building found that part. It did not invent it. It did not twist it. It only wrote it down. That was what made it unbearable. I didn't paint anymore. I left the bucket. I left the brush and the sledgehammer in the trunk. I understood that there was nothing to break because the building wasn't the thing that was haunting me. The wall wasn't even the thing. The thing was that I had carried a secret for 23 years, specifically so that it would never be written down, never be made real, never be official. and the building had made it official. You cannot make an official thing unofficial. That's not how records work. That's the whole horror of records. They're permanent on purpose. We built them to be permanent. We built a place specifically to make the truth survive us, and we filled it with the truth. And we shouldn't be surprised that the truth, given 78 years and the right kind of hunger, learned to want the rest of itself. The building was demolished that winter. The developer's crew took it down in February. And I drove past while they were doing it, and I'll tell you what I saw, and it's the last thing I'll tell you. The walls came down in slabs, the way old plaster does, and the inside walls, the ones nobody outside had ever seen, were exposed to daylight for the first time in years as the machines pulled the building open. And the exposed walls were not white or brown or stained with age. They were gray with writing. Every interior wall, top to bottom, gray with the neat, sloping hand. So dense it looked like the walls had been painted that color. Decades of confession written over confession. The whole secret record of a county. And the crew didn't even notice because to them it was just a dirty old building coming down. Just water stains and grime and a job to finish before the snow. They loaded it into trucks. They hauled it to the landfill. Tons of it. Tons of true things that people died to keep quiet. Broken into rubble and buried in a field. Nobody read a single word. I used to think that meant it was over. That the wall was gone. So the record was gone. So I was free. I held on to that the way I'd held on to vandalism, the way I hold on to everything I need to be true. But the building's hand isn't in the building. I know that now. I learned it last month. I'd gone almost a year telling myself I'd survived, that the demolition had ended it, that whatever count of days Owen got, I'd outlasted because the wall was rubble before it could finish me. Last month I emptied my coat pocket and found a receipt I did not remember keeping. I almost threw it away, and then I saw the back. One line of pencil, neat, sloping, fresh enough that the graphite came off on my thumb. The sentence was not finished. I stopped halfway through a word, like whoever was writing it had only paused. So that's why I keep the lights on and keep paper out of the house. And don't read what's written on any surface I pass, not because it will save me. I don't think anything saves me. I think I'm being written down slowly on whatever's at hand, the way it took its time with the wall. And I think when the sentence is finished, I'll drive off a straight road on a dry night, and they'll say I must have fallen asleep. I'm telling you all of this, every part of it, the affair and the relief and the cowardice and Owen, because I have decided that if I am going to be written down, I would rather be the one who writes it. I would rather say it out loud myself, here to you, in my own clumsy hand and my own tired voice, than leave it to that neat sloping patience to make it official in the dark. Maybe that's nothing. Maybe the wall, wherever it is now, has already recorded all of this and is just letting me think the words are mine. But Caroline doesn't remember the affair because she doesn't remember me. And so the only place it has ever truly been confessed, the only place the truth of it was ever made real and said and owned by the man who did it, is right here in what I've just told you. Not on a wall, not in graphite. Here. I'd like to believe that counts for something. That a thing you confess yourself is different from a thing that's confessed out of you. I keep the lights on and I keep telling it, my version, before the other version is finished. I just wish I knew which word it stopped in the middle of. Because if I knew the word, maybe I would know how much of me is left.